You know what's louder than 1,000 words? Silence. The kind of silence that doesn't just fall over you, it follows you. The kind that makes you question every memory, every conversation, every moment you shared with him. You sit there, scrolling through your phone, rereading old messages like they're sacred texts, looking for clues, signs, something to explain why he's vanished. No call, no message, just quiet, and it's deafening. But what if I told you his silence isn't the absence of feelings? What if his silence is screaming your name? You see, when a man suddenly pulls away, it's easy to assume he stopped caring. It's easier to believe we did something wrong. We start to shrink ourselves, second-guess our worth, replay the last conversation over and over again, trying to decode it like it was some ancient riddle. But here's what you need to understand. Silence doesn't always mean indifference. Sometimes it's the weight of everything he's feeling but doesn't know how to express. Sometimes silence is fear. Sometimes it's confusion. Sometimes it's love that feels too overwhelming to be spoken. And sometimes silence is strategy. Let's be real for a moment. We live in a world where people ghost instead of confront, where we avoid hard conversations and choose vanishing acts over vulnerability. But if you pay attention, silence communicates. The lack of words is its own kind of message. A man might not text you, but he checks your stories. He might not say your name, but he brings you up in conversations to mutual friends. He might not reach out, but he shows up in all the ways that don't require courage. That's not coincidence. That's presence without permission. But here's the twist. Just because his silence is screaming your name doesn't mean you need to answer. This is the moment you need to stop waiting for his voice to validate your value. You don't need a message to know you mattered. You don't need his return to prove your worth. You already know what you brought to the table. You know how you loved, how you showed up, how you cared. That was your truth. And his silence. That's his journey, his burden, his growth curve. Stop chasing closure from someone who wasn't brave enough to give you answers. Sometimes the silence is the answer. Now I know that hurts. I know the silence plays in your mind like a broken record. But let me tell you this. Your healing doesn't live in his words. It lives in your decision to move forward. Not to prove a point, not to make him regret, but because you deserve peace. You deserve someone who chooses you out loud, who doesn't make you guess, who doesn't go quiet when things get real. You deserve someone who says your name with intention, not hesitation. So stop decoding him. Start discovering you again. The love you're searching for isn't in the echo of someone's silence. It's in the way you refuse to let silence define your story. It's in the way you get up every day, put your heart back together, and walk with grace even when your soul is bruised. That's power. That's beauty. That's the kind of woman a real man prays for. Because here's the truth most people won't tell you. If he's meant for you, he won't stay silent forever. Real connection doesn't die in silence. It either breaks or it builds. And if it builds, he'll come back, not with mixed signals, but with clarity, with maturity, with action. But by then, maybe you'll be too far gone. Maybe you'll have grown so much in his absence that his words won't carry the same weight anymore. And that's okay. Let that be your victory. Let growth be your revenge. Let silence fuel your fire, not freeze your heart. The most attractive thing you can do right now is choose yourself. Not because you're trying to make him notice, but because you finally noticed you. You saw the way you were still loving through the confusion. You witnessed your loyalty, your patience, your strength. That's rare, that's precious, that's yours. So if his silence is screaming your name, let it scream. Let it echo through the distance. But you, keep walking, keep rising, keep becoming. One day, he might break that silence. He might finally speak. But by then, your name will be written in places far bigger than his world. Spoken in rooms filled with people who see you, choose you, and never go silent on you again. Because silence might scream, but you roar. When someone you care about goes silent, the first instinct is to assume the worst. He must not care anymore. Maybe I meant nothing. These thoughts hit like a tidal wave and pull you under, making you question everything. But here's the truth. Silence isn't always a sign of indifference. It can be a mask for feelings too intense to handle. Some people don't know how to process their emotions, so instead of facing them, they shut down. It's not because they don't feel. It's because they do, and it overwhelms them. Men, especially, are often taught to internalize rather than express. Vulnerability is uncomfortable. It threatens the idea of control. So rather than say, I miss you, I'm confused, or I'm afraid, he goes silent. Not because he doesn't want to talk, but because he doesn't know how to say what he's truly feeling. Silence becomes a defense mechanism, a way to delay confrontation with his own emotional truth. It's not your job to fix that. But understanding that his silence might be fear, not indifference, allows you to stop blaming yourself for his emotional unavailability. Sometimes a man can care deeply, but still disappear. Sometimes love doesn't show up as presence, but as absence that's too heavy for him to carry out loud. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. And when you understand that his silence may be rooted in fear, confusion, or emotional paralysis, you stop taking it as a direct attack on your worth. You start to see it for what it really is, his limitation, not your failure. But here's the key. Even if his silence is filled with emotion, it's still silence. And silence, no matter the reason, creates distance. So while his silence may not be indifference, it's also not effort. It's not love in action. And you deserve love that doesn't hide behind silence. You deserve love that communicates, that shows up, that speaks when it matters most. Because real love, healthy love, is not afraid of its own voice. And when that silence lingers, it starts speaking in ways louder than any conversation ever could. It becomes a message you can't ignore. Every hour without a reply, every unanswered call, every online notification without a follow-through, it all builds a language of its own. You begin to realize that silence is communication. It tells you where you stand. It tells you how much space you occupy in his daily thoughts. It may not come in the form of kind words or confessions, but the silence itself forms a narrative. The question is, are you willing to listen to what it's truly saying? It's easy to romanticize the silence, to believe he's battling with emotions, that any moment now he'll reach out with a beautifully vulnerable explanation. But often, silence isn't a dramatic pause before a grand gesture. It's just silence. And that's something we resist accepting. Because once we accept that silence is a message, we're forced to confront a truth that hurts. If he wanted to speak, he would. If he wanted to make the effort, nothing, not fear, pride, or distance, would stop him. That realization stings because we want to believe in potential. We want to believe in the what-ifs more than the reality right in front of us. But the longer we refuse to hear what silence is saying, the more we delay our healing. Because deep down, you already know what that silence is telling you. It's telling you where his priorities are. It's showing you what he's willing or not willing to do for this connection. And as painful as that truth may be, it's a gift. Because it gives you clarity. It gives you power. It gives you the chance to stop waiting for someone who has already stopped showing up. So instead of filling the silence with false hope, let it be what it is, a message, one that sets you free. And yet, even after recognizing the message in his silence, we still turn inward. We still question ourselves. We start retracing every word we said, every photo we posted, every moment we might have seemed too much or not enough. That's the dangerous spiral, when someone else's lack of communication becomes the mirror we use to evaluate our self-worth. But let's be honest, you didn't suddenly become less valuable just because he stopped talking. His silence didn't erase your kindness, your loyalty, your beauty, or the depth of your heart. It simply revealed his inability to handle all that you are. Still, you shrink. You begin to tone yourself down, hoping maybe if you had been a little more understanding, a little less emotional, a little quieter, he wouldn't have gone silent. But that's not how healthy love works. You don't have to shrink to be loved. You don't have to guess your way through someone else's emotional immaturity. When someone is truly aligned with your spirit, they embrace your fullness, not just your fragments. They lean into conversations, not away from them. So stop asking what you did wrong and start asking why you ever felt responsible for someone else's emotional silence. That's not a weight you're meant to carry. Your job is not to decode his actions or silence just to feel secure. Your job is to remember who you are before you started questioning yourself through his lens. You are still whole, still worthy, still more than enough. His silence doesn't get to decide the volume of your voice or the brightness of your light. Don't shrink to fit into the silence. Rise above it and let it prove what you never needed in the first place. And as you start rising from that space of doubt, you begin to notice something strange. He hasn't completely disappeared. He's just selectively absent. He might not be texting you, but he's watching your stories. He's liking that one picture weeks later, as if to stir something. He's showing up in all the subtle digital ways that suggest he hasn't fully let go. But here's the thing, presence without courage isn't love. Checking in without speaking up isn't commitment. That's emotional limbo, and it keeps you stuck in a cycle where you feel seen but never truly valued. It's tempting to take those little moments, those passive appearances, as signs that he still cares. And maybe he does. But care without action is like a locked door without a key. It doesn't open anything. It doesn't move anything forward. It just reminds you what you don't have. When someone really wants you in their life, they don't hover quietly in the background. They step into your world and make it known. They speak your name, not just in silence, but with effort, with clarity, with presence that means something. So don't confuse breadcrumbs for a meal. Don't let minimal effort feed your hopes. You deserve more than someone who stays close enough to feel familiar, but distant enough to avoid real connection. That's not romantic, it's manipulative. Whether it's intentional or not, it keeps your heart tied to someone who's not showing up in the way you need. You weren't created to be someone's halfway decision. If he can't find the courage to speak, to show up, to love you out loud, then you need to find the courage to walk away from the echo of what could have been. Because your soul isn't made for silence. It's made for connection that is real, steady, and whole. And the hardest part is, even when you see all of this clearly, even when you recognize the silence for what it is, you still crave closure. You want an explanation, a final conversation, something to make sense of the ending. You want words to match the weight of what you felt. But sometimes the person who hurt you doesn't have the capacity to give you that kind of ending. And waiting for closure from someone who already let you go in silence is like waiting for an apology from someone who doesn't even realize the damage they've done, or worse, doesn't care enough to acknowledge it. That's the truth no one wants to accept. That silence might be the only closure you ever get. And that's not fair, but it's reality. And clinging to the hope that he'll come back to explain things, to justify the silence, only traps you in a cycle of emotional dependency. You give away your peace day by day, while he's already moved on from the conversation you're still rehearsing in your head. But you don't need his words to validate your experience. You lived it, you loved, you felt, you tried. That's real, that's enough. Closure isn't something someone else gives you. It's a decision you make when you choose to stop reliving the pain and start reclaiming your power. It's when you say, even if I never get the answers, I still deserve to heal. Because healing isn't about what he says or doesn't say, it's about what you allow yourself to let go of. It's realizing that your peace isn't dependent on someone else's clarity. It lives in your decision to stop looking backward and finally move forward without needing anything more from him. Let silence be the ending. Let you be the closure. And once you let silence be the ending, something remarkable begins to happen. You start to feel the weight lifting. The knots in your chest begin to loosen, not because the pain is gone, but because you're no longer fighting to make sense of it. You begin to realize that your peace was never meant to be negotiated. It was never meant to be delayed until someone decided you were worth responding to. Your peace is yours, and you deserve it now, not after an apology, not after closure, not after he finally figures himself out. So many people give up their inner calm just to hold space for someone who's not even showing up. You replay his absence like a loop, wondering what it means, wondering if he'll return, when all it's really doing is stealing your present. You weren't meant to live in emotional limbo. That space between what he once was and what he refuses to be now is not a place for you to build a home. That's not where your joy lives. That's not where your healing grows. When you finally choose peace over confusion, when you choose stillness over searching, you gain something far more powerful than answers. You gain yourself. You stop bending for someone who wasn't willing to meet you halfway. You stop shrinking in the hope he'll return and start expanding into the person you were always meant to be. Because your peace, your emotional, mental, and spiritual peace, is not something you should ever compromise for someone else's silence. You deserve love that doesn't make you question your sanity. You deserve communication that doesn't leave you grasping at air. And you deserve someone who doesn't go missing when things get deep. The moment you start protecting your peace above his potential, you start to feel whole again. Not because he changed, but because you did. And that's the turning point. That's when silence loses its grip and your power begins to rise. And as your power begins to rise, something even deeper begins to unfold. You start remembering who you were before all of this. Before the waiting, before the confusion, before the endless analysis of what went wrong. You begin to rediscover the parts of yourself that got buried under all that emotional weight. The laughter that once came easily. The confidence that didn't rely on being seen. The dreams, the passions, the sense of wholeness that was never meant to be built around someone else's attention. You start realizing that the version of you who existed before the silence is still in there. Only now, she's stronger, wiser, more grounded. And it's in this rediscovery that real healing happens. Because now you're not just letting go of him, you're choosing you. You're choosing to fill the silence with your own voice again. You're choosing to fill your days with things that bring you peace, purpose, and joy. Not the anxiety of wondering whether he'll reappear. You stop waiting for someone to remind you that you matter because you finally remembered it yourself. This is what growth looks like, not just moving on, but moving inward. Not just surviving the silence, but rising through it. Rebuilding from the pieces and realizing that you don't need to be rescued. You were never broken. You were simply paused, waiting for the moment you'd step back into your own life and claim it fully. And now that you are, there's no version of you that needs to settle for anything less than being chosen clearly, wholly, and without hesitation. The more you rediscover yourself, the less you tolerate confusion disguised as love. And the more you rediscover who you are, the clearer it becomes that your value was never dependent on someone else's ability to see it. You start to understand, deep in your bones, that just because someone went silent doesn't mean you became less worthy. His silence was never a measurement of your beauty, your depth, or your capacity to love. It was only ever a reflection of his limitations, his fears, his unreadiness, his lack of emotional courage. And no matter how deeply you cared or how much you hoped, you cannot force someone to meet you at the level of love you're capable of giving. You begin to separate your identity from his absence. You stop tying your self-esteem to someone else's actions or inactions. You no longer sit by the phone hoping for a text that proves you are enough, because now you know you are. Your worth isn't a question waiting for someone else to answer. It's a fact you begin to live by. Every time you choose your peace, every time you walk away from confusion, every time you refuse to shrink to fit into someone's silence, you reinforce that truth. This is what true freedom looks like. When you no longer need someone to come back and validate your experience. When you don't measure your value by who stays, who speaks, or who finally apologizes, because you've already accepted the only truth that matters. You are enough, exactly as you are. You are worthy of love that doesn't leave you questioning. And you are done letting someone else's silence define your identity. And as that truth settles in, you begin to make different choices, not out of bitterness, not to prove a point, but because you're finally choosing yourself from a place of clarity. You stop reaching out to someone who doesn't reach back. You stop giving energy to one-sided hope. And most importantly, you stop waiting to be chosen because you've already chosen yourself. You no longer need someone to see your worth for it to exist. You embody it. You walk with it. You speak from it. You live by it. And that self-choosing energy is magnetic. It shifts everything. Suddenly, you're no longer available for halfway love. You're no longer interested in chasing people who run or decoding men who vanish. You only have room for what aligns with your peace, your growth, your truth. You no longer see love as something to earn. It becomes something you reflect back, something you protect, something you share only with those who are ready for it. Choosing yourself doesn't mean you stop loving others. It means you love from a full place, not an empty one. It means your boundaries are clearer, your heart is stronger, and your time is no longer wasted on what doesn't reciprocate. That shift, that decision, is the final breakthrough. Because in choosing yourself, you reclaim every part of you that ever felt small, silenced, or overlooked. And from here forward, the only love you'll entertain is the kind that sees you, hears you, and speaks your name, not through silence, but with certainty. So now you see, it was never really about the silence, it was about what you chose to do with it. You could have let it break you, define you, diminish you, but instead you allowed it to awaken you. You allowed it to become the turning point. The moment you stopped chasing echoes and started listening to your own voice again. The moment you realized that the love you were waiting to receive was the love you needed to give yourself all along. His silence may have screamed your name, but your healing speaks volumes louder. You've risen from confusion into clarity, from waiting into walking, from being overlooked to being undeniable. You no longer beg to be chosen. You are the choice. You've remembered your worth, reclaimed your peace, and rewritten the narrative that once left you powerless. And now your silence isn't rooted in pain. It's rooted in power. Let him wonder. Let him feel the absence of your presence the way you once felt his. Because the truth is, when you choose yourself fully, you no longer fear who stays or who leaves. You become whole, with or without them. That is the victory. That is the healing. That is the love story that was always meant to begin with you.